All right. Thanks so much, Jeff, for that. Appreciate that. And if anybody has any questions for Jeff, I'm sure you can find Jeff after the session here, walking around, get some coffee with him as well. So appreciate it. So with that, bring up our final panel before the break. Burj Avazian from Wireless 2020. Come moderate this one, Burj. And then his panel members as well, Derek Curtin. Who else we got coming up? Fred Campbell, I believe. And some others. Please come on up. Billy also. Yeah, come on up, guys. All right. Head on over there. All right.
Well, I won't let the dead airs rest. I was interested to know that my first, one of my rapid fire presenters at Mimosa showed an economics model, which very much agreed with the panel before us, illustrating how much cellular operators in the 5G world need to drop their prices to have an active role. That as a startup, he was showing data to back up the same thing. It's pretty interesting. Link those together.
Well, Derek, thank you for using up that dead air. It took us a few seconds to get up on the podium. And thank you guys for all staying until after hours. So first thing you'll notice is we have two panel members here, and I appreciate them being here as well. You already met Derek Curtin, who's founder of Telecom Council. You also are meeting Dilip Sihari, who's Director of Legislative and Government Affairs with TIA. Does that mean you're lobbying the Russians?
Not quite.
Not quite. Okay, good. We'll keep you off CNN in that case.
Right.
You don't want to get in fake news.
The American government is hard enough.
All right. By the way, can you hear us okay? Should we talk louder? Okay, cool. So the missing panelist is Fred Campbell, who's Director of Technology and the former chief of the FCC Wireless Telecom Bureau under the previous administration, George Bush administration. Unfortunately, apparently, he may find himself with a new appointment, so he couldn't get to Austin this week and couldn't be here. The topic we have is how spectrum policy drives 5G innovation. And Dan was nice enough to hand me that title when we started. I'm going to rearrange the words a little bit, keep the same words, and say, how does 5G spectrum policy drive innovation? Okay, so we're going to talk about the policies around 5G and how that drives innovation rather than merely talk about 5G innovation, if that's okay. We had organized this session so each of us was given topics to discuss, and Fred was given 3 of these topics. So since he's unable to be here, he sent me some prepared slides, and I'll try and run through them for you if that's all right. If I make any mistakes, who is going to point them out? Can anybody help me with that? Okay, cool. So the first question is, how has the FCC done to date in allocating spectrum for 5G? So you might start by saying, what have they done? And then how have they done? Okay? So you may have heard that the FCC unanimously opened up nearly 11 gigahertz of spectrum for 5G. By the way, which FCC was it that did that?
Martin FCC. It was one of the few things they've done unanimously as well.
Yeah, so it was under Tom Wheeler, and it was under the Obama administration. So it was before Inauguration Day, probably November of last year, I think it was, right around, I can't remember if it was before or after the election.
It was before the election.
It was before the election,
Yeah.
Okay. So they were, in the last days of the FCC back then, and they got ahead of the curve by allocating 11 gigahertz of spectrum for 5G. And the 2 charts there are intended to complement that statement. The first is to describe the bands that they allocated for use in 5G. You'll notice that the caption is a bit off. It says possible mobile use. That's one way to interpret it. But in fact, it was really for 5G purposes, and it shows the bands above 24 gigahertz that were allocated for this purpose. Now, one thing you'll notice as well is that the initial idea was to get above 6 gigahertz. 6 gigahertz is kind of the top end of where LTE resides, and 3GPP has been mapping out spectrum. And unfortunately, they left the whole range between 6 gigahertz and 24 gigahertz without any 5G spectrum allocation. And they leaped up to the 28 gigahertz band above 24, and therefore, kind of there's a huge gap. But that's the only way to get 11 gigahertz of spectrum, apparently. Is that right, guys?
Yeah, and out of that 11 gigahertz, the thing to know is that most of it is actually, I think 7 gigahertz of it is unlicensed spectrum up at the 64 gigahertz band. So it's a somewhat smaller amount of licensed spectrum in the 28, 37, and 39 gigahertz bands.
Yeah, so the first two, 28 and 39, are both licensed. And we'll talk a little bit about where they came from in a second. But what were you going to say, Derek?
I was just going to say that the obvious reason is that all the sub 28 gigahertz spectrum is otherwise being used in ways that would be difficult to displace and refarm, and this very high millimeter wave spectrum is very much point to point, very local. So the notion of interfering with other radios is greatly diminished.
So you and I have opinions on things. I have a slightly different one than yours.
Great.
I think they were largely driven by the desire on the U.S. carriers to use spectrum bands that had been previously used and failed, in this case for LMDS, and they were able to acquire those bands by M&A, by buying companies that also held that spectrum, and it's licensed spectrum, so it's somewhat protected. I think there's plenty of spectrum between 6 and 24 gigahertz that they could have found, and I'm wondering whether the Ajit Pai administration of the FCC will look back and find new spectrum bands, particularly unlicensed bands or shared bands, but we'll come back to that in a second. The other chart on here is to show the order of magnitude difference in speed that is expected to be derived from 5G as a result of that spectrum being available. So going from a 6-minute download to 3.6 seconds, trying to show how dramatic the effect will be. The other is to explain how it is in the US we allocated certain bands versus those that are now being allocated in Europe and elsewhere. So if you look at the lineup, Europe is on the left, the USA is on the right. So immediately you realize they don't line up. There are no common bands for 5G across US and Europe, and you see immediately why would it not align? Why wouldn't you just squish these two together and say, okay, Europe is talking about spectrum that's in that 6 to 24. There are 3 bands between 6 and 24 gigahertz that Europe is talking about. US has ignored them. US is focused on LMDS bands. Europe has ignored them. And even though they have something in common in the very high frequency bands, again, they're different. So there's no global alignment in these spectrum bands, right? Okay, guys, at least you didn't disagree with me there. All right, next question is, will the FCC's policy for CBRS spectrum sharing and SAS serve as the foundation for 5G spectrum sharing? So again, we need to get some fundamentals out here. What is CBRS? Derek, you want to give us an explanation?
No, I'm going to pass that off.
Okay, if you guys can't handle it, I'll do it.
That's all right. So CBRS is the 3.5 gigahertz band from, I think it's 3550 to 3650 megahertz. And the FCC has set up essentially a 3-tier system for priority in that band, where the tier 1 are the federal government incumbents, I think the Navy, among others. And then tier 2 are what we would normally think of as licensed users, PAL, Priority Access License. And then tier 3 is quasi-unlicensed. It's general authorized access, or what we would call licensed by rule.
So the point is they created a scheme to share spectrum among the military, on the one hand, among incumbents who currently are licensed in these bands, and to free up a whole new domain, 70 megahertz domain, that would become available as a result of spectrum sharing. And the SAS is a database system that controls the use of that shared spectrum and makes sure that we minimize interference and get everybody out of the way when the Navy comes to shore. Right?
That's the general idea.
That's
yeah.
the general idea. So the question is, will this scheme serve as the foundation for how spectrum sharing might occur in 5G? And the quick answer is, so far, they haven't contemplated spectrum sharing in 5G yet. And although they anticipate they will, because government is holding lots of spectrum that they could free up, particularly in that 6 to 24 domain, you could imagine that they could come up with this kind of method, but they have to prove it works first. They have to show that in a band that's already in use, in 3.5, 3.6, that this SAS system will work. And there are a couple of companies that are facing this right now. One is Federated Wireless, from whom I stole this slide, and the other is Google, who controls everything. What? I'm sorry, I missed
They got a database.
Yeah, they don't control entirely everything, but just about everything. Okay, let's quickly go to the next subject. How will the 5G spectrum policy differ from 4G? And particularly, will it rely on auctions or more on unlicensed and shared spectrum? So we're focused on the US now, remember, okay? We only had 3 bands that we got spectrum in to get that 11 gigahertz, 2 of which were licensed, right?
3 of which were licensed.
3 of which were licensed.
Yeah.
And of those, are any going to be auctioned?
I think that's the plan, yeah, for the 28, 37, and 39 gigahertz bands.
Well,
yeah.
but I believe that people already control the licenses for 2 of those bands at least.
Well, so what the FCC did in the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding is you do have some incumbent LMDS operators there, but now they're opening up those bands for mobile allocations as well. So I think the idea, sorry if I'm mistaken on this, is to auction all 3 of those bands for mobile licenses.
And you expect it to be a conventional auction, highest bidder kind of thing, even though the 600 megahertz auction just failed?
Well, I do think it's probably going to follow the FCC standard procedures for auctions, yes.
Derek?
Are the LMDS providers, they're not across the nation, right? There's certain pockets where they exist and certain pockets where the spectrum
They're
is
licensed by major metros.
Yeah, so there's certain areas
Most
where,
of the licenses fall in the hands of 3 or 4 operators that had aggregated them already.
and of course those are in the more desirable markets, but there are service areas that are open.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I'd have to agree that the 700 megahertz auction was a failure. So that model is in doubt. But I think optimistically, with a certain amount of adjusting, the incentive auction process might work fairly well. So if you address the deficiencies of it and try to re-auction, I have measured confidence that might work.
So just wanted to share a different perspective. In our view, the 700 megahertz, 600 megahertz auction has actually been a success. I know that's not what a lot of people think, because after the AWS-3 federal spectrum auction, people's expectations were sort of reset much higher. But that auction is about to close, and I think it's raised nearly $20 billion. So it's actually more than anyone predicted when Congress authorized the auction 5 years ago. So a lot of our folks think that auction is actually a success. I know that doesn't fit the narrative.
No. I completely agree that from the carrier's perspective, they got a bargain. Mm-hmm. And from the broadcaster's perspective, they now regret giving up their spectrum and wonder whether they could have done better, but obviously they didn't. It was a rare case in which the prices came down rather than going up. So, that's interesting in and of itself. Mm-hmm. But the flip side of this is whether there's an appetite for auctions anymore, particularly auctions where the prices go up. And my view on this is that in 28 and 39, we're now taking preemptive measures to block auctions by acquiring the companies that hold those licenses or secure those licenses in advance of an auction to become incumbents. And I think both Verizon and AT&T are kind of trying to get ready to do that, if I'm not mistaken. But we can also disagree, and there are different views.
I don't know when the right time is to kick in, with open discussion on this, but I'll try now. The fact that auctions prices have been functioned more or less predictably in the past, say 50 years, with steadily increasing prices until you close the auction, there has been a reliance on science continuing in the same way, and radio technologies following more or less the same pattern. Better modulation schemes, perhaps, but the notion of you can't do much with unlicensed lasted a long time. Even just here today, I see a number of, on my panel, we have MOSA and other companies talking about alternative radio technologies. There's a company called Artemis out of San Francisco. I haven't seen their stuff, but they promise radically different ways of using spectrum. There's a lot of people promising to do interesting things in white spaces. This is not, factual, this can do this for sure without interfering things. But with all of those possible alternative radio technologies that can work without necessarily killing the existing models, there's a possibility that the value of the existing models diminishes. And so it's not so much just about did the broadcasters get what they wanted, it's about is a licensed spectrum going to maintain the same value it has historically had. And that's much higher discussion than specifically talking bandwidth frequency by frequency.
And I'll tell you, if the pattern had continued to escalate those prices, you wonder where the money for infrastructure comes from, given how much they were paying just for the spectrum resources themselves. So, Dilip, now we're turning to you for your perspective on your questions. Unfortunately, I didn't build you a slide deck, so you're going to have to freelance on these, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
So let's start with the first one. What have been the major challenges facing the U.S. and other spectrum policymakers in allocating spectrum for 5G?
Well, I think we've started going through some of them. Especially if you're talking about the millimeter wave spectrum, there are some incumbents in the bands. The FCC has been able to identify a few places where there are more relative green fields. But when at the World Radio Conference 2015, for example, you ran into opposition from satellite operators, especially in Europe. So that's why on that earlier chart, Europe doesn't line up on 28 gigahertz. But the FCC decided to go forward anyway. So they've moved ahead on 3 bands, but there is a further notice of proposed rulemaking that's right now pending at the FCC, which would propose to open up an additional 5 more bands of millimeter wave spectrum. It hasn't been a partisan issue. The Commission has been moving forward unanimously, both under Chairman Wheeler, and people are expecting that under Chairman Pai, it's going to keep moving forward ahead. But more broadly, the challenge, I think, is, of course, it's not just millimeter wave spectrum. You're also going to need lower and mid-band spectrum as well. And there's only so much to go around. And finding additional spectrum, about 70% of which is held by the federal government in some capacity, is really hard. And so a lot of the easy things have already been done. And so both the FCC and Congress and the NTIA are having to go band by band and do these studies to try and find, hey, where is it that we can make progress in another band to get this opened or transitioned over to commercial use?
And in particular, if there are government incumbents occupying those bands or other users that are not fully employing those bands and are sitting on that spectrum, perhaps there are ways to pry that open, just like we did it with broadcasters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason that I have optimism on this is because when that happens, if you have federal government users who can find more ways to efficiently use the spectrum or be repacked into narrower bands, and then the government can sell that off, this raises money for the Treasury. So it is actually one of the rare things that Congress actually wants to do on a bipartisan basis. So there's a bill right now that's moving through the Senate called Mobile Now that would open additional spectrum. So we're actually optimistic that there may be further progress.
Great. Let's move to your next question. We already talked about how the U.S. and Europe differ. How does that differ from Japan, China, and Korea?
Well, I know they're moving ahead. Japan and Korea, I think, have talked about 5G trials for their Olympics in 2018 and 2020. I'm sorry, I don't remember which one is which. But I think actually the Asian countries sided with the United States, if memory serves, at the last World Radio Conference. They wanted to push ahead in 28 gigahertz. So the message that I've been trying to convey to policymakers in Congress and at the FCC is, look, the U.S. can't be left behind. The Europeans are moving on this. The Asian countries are moving on this. So Congress and the FCC just need to keep moving ahead to open more spectrum so that the U.S. isn't left behind. I think that's part of the reason why the FCC acted relatively boldly to move ahead on 28 gigahertz.
I'd like to jump in on this one and say one clear distinction is that absolutely China and to a lesser extent South Korea have a history and a policy around saying forget the rest of the world harmonization. We're going to try to go drive our own standard, get it slightly ahead of everybody else, and get the volumes and the scales up, and then export that as a de facto standard. And they've had I'd say mixed success, but mostly failure with that policy and their desire to have their own kind of 3G, their own kind of secure Wi-Fi, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, they have the lingering legacies of those efforts within China that do have scale and last for an extremely long time, like TD-SCDMA, CDMA, and others. So that's one of the things that distinguishes China. As I said, to a lesser extent, South Korea. The difference between China and South Korea is when South Korea loses one of those gambits, they fall in line with the rest of the world, whereas China just carries on.
Although I haven't noticed China trying to dictate 5G spectrum policy or standards, they seem to have fallen in line for this one.
Just in general, the characteristics are such, and they will try that as they can, because it can be a strategic advantage if they can get to scale first.
They're listening. I've had occasions to meet with Chinese officials from MIT a couple of times on spectrum policy. They are following very closely what the United States is doing. They're listening. We are hoping to bring them along to create more alignment.
Last question for you, Dilip, is what are the prospects for global or universal spectrum bands allocated for 5G? You saw my chart. Doesn't look very good, does it?
Well, for example, I don't think that the story on 28 gigahertz is necessarily finished. At the last World Radio Conference, it did not move ahead because there was objection from some operators, especially I think in Europe. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of momentum for that band in the rest of the world. And clearly the history, I think, in the past is that U.S. allocations have very often driven what ultimately happens later on. And I think we're going to see that too with the incentive auction down at 600 megahertz. So it's not there yet, but I think as time continues, some of these bands will move in that direction.
So, Derek, we started a topic which I then morphed a little bit and asked the question, how does 5G spectrum policy drive innovation? So we tried to round out the questions by really focusing on innovation. You had a session earlier where there were some innovative companies that are trying to pry open the markets and be a bit disruptive, change the game, change the rules. How will the FCC spectrum policy related to 5G shape innovation by wireless operators, by vendors, and by disruptive startups in the U.S. market?
Right, and this is, this first question is kind of where I relate to the panel the most. Where we are in Silicon Valley, we see a number of interesting companies coming up. We, my panel earlier had people making chips, had people making devices for building networks, so network infrastructure. In every one of those cases, they need to have confidence that that spectrum is going to be available for them for the long term before they invest. It takes a significant amount of capital from the VCs to kick off a startup, and you need certainty that a band is going to be available before you can get the funding, before you can go out and build it. So we will, until there is any kind of confidence in spectrum being available and what will be allowed to be built on that spectrum, what the output powers were, you can't build a business model and go to a VC and ask for the money. So the countries that define spectrum policy early will have the benefit of greater access to capital to build on those technologies. There's a huge time to market advantage in terms of laying down spectrum policy. There's a lot of things where being first will actually just mean you get more arrows in your back, but defining spectrum policy gets nation's innovation stimulated, gets capital free flowing, reduces the risk, and that's a key factor, reducing risk.
So what happens, though, if that spectrum policy favors incumbents and large dominant players who hope to keep the status quo?
Well, yeah, so that's, that's obvious, and I'll probably have some disagreements with people in the room and Dilip and stuff on that. I am in favor, in me personally and as a member of the Telecom Council of Silicon Valley, we're pro-innovation, we're pro-pushing technologies forward. We have seen tremendous dividends paid in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. And 2.4 gigahertz bears it's a distant cousin of all this millimeter stuff. For one reason is that it was considered a garbage band very early in the 40s and 50s because it resonates water and therefore has bad attenuation. You can't really predict its performance, whether it rains or whether trees grow leaves and affect your network performance. So as a result, it was left as kind of something not particularly useful, ISM band that people could tinker with. The amount of, as I said once again, dividends in industrial and commercial activity grown on that garbage band is phenomenal. So millimeter wave is a distant cousin because it was considered too short range, too difficult to make any kind of commercial success with it. So it was kind of left on the back burner until the modern technologies were able to make hay of that field. I know you got different views. So, and I know there's people existing on it. There's plus point-to-point radio, satellite, and things happening there. But there's a relationship between those two, and that earlier they weren't available, and now they're available. And there's an opportunity to leave some of that field open to people to plant whatever seeds they may choose to pick, and to see what kind of fruits are born out of it. And we can see that that's already been outlined. So the question then becomes, great, the FCC is on board. It seems like industry is on board. Then the question is, how much? And I don't believe there is a firm answer for how much. I'm very happy to see the amount that's available because I think if I listen to the promises of the people that say, oh, we can take unlicensed spectrum and work without interfering with neighboring radios, okay, well, if that's the claim, then how much do you need, right? If you can work without interfering with neighboring radios, 6 gigahertz might be enough. So I am somebody who has one foot in this innovation camp where I believe we should leave that a lot of spectrum available to those people to tinker with and do things. I think things will come of that. But I also believe that we don't want to disrupt existing business, existing incumbent players who are providing very valuable services, 911 emergency responder services, Navy, government services as well. We want to we're going to need to be in a period of time where we transition in a very steady and thought out way from the 20th century way of doing radios to what might be maybe the 22nd century that we'll see, maybe the end of this century and then next year. It will need to be an intelligent transition. Do I believe that in the next century we're going to be allocating spectrum licenses and you're going to need a spectrum license? I guess if I'm talking 21, way out, no, I don't think so.
Well,
but I think for this century we do.
I don't know if you heard, but there was a presidential decree that was signed this morning that all spectrum regulation was suspended, and we could do whatever we wanted.
I have to leave you.
Okay, cool.
I mean, to their credit, I think the FCC is actually on board with much of what you just laid out. I mean, in the Spectrum Frontiers order, they open 11 gigahertz of spectrum, of which 7 is unlicensed spectrum from 64 to 71 gigahertz, and that is adjacent to another 7 gigahertz band from 57 to 64, creating essentially a 14 gigahertz. This isn't megahertz. This is gigahertz block of unlicensed spectrum. It's a huge block.
Which is great. It's way up there, but
it's way up there. I'll grant you that. And meanwhile, they're opening bands of licensed spectrum in 28, 37, 39. They're looking at 5 more. In the CBRS band at 3.5 gigahertz, they're trying to do something innovative with the 3-tier model with sort of dynamic access and database, white spaces kinds of approaches to sharing and small cells. And meanwhile, their technical rules, they're trying to be very, they have the LTE specifications sort of in mind when they're setting the power levels, but they're not actually mandating that this needs to be some new flavor of 3GPP technology. They're being technology neutral about the whole thing. So I think the Commission sees that what they're doing is leading the world and is trying to be technology neutral and open the door for the innovators that are here at this conference to do their thing.
Derek, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the middle question. Sure. I think it's important to note that both millimeter wave and microwave bands were previously used for backhaul and are now being turned to 5G access in many cases. And so there's some question about not only the performance and appropriateness of those allocations, but also what happens to backhaul. And I think we could debate that, but it probably is the wrong thing to be doing right now here. I'd like to skip.
I think the good news is I believe that can be used for both backhaul and access. Obviously, you want to have some kind of separation, but...
In fact, we may not be able to tell the difference at some point.
Fair enough,
but let's go on to the last question, and I'd love to get both of you to chime in. Will there be enough spectrum available to drive 5G innovation among all the players in this ecosystem? Major carriers, small operators, innovators, and companies that are hidden innovators, huge innovators like Facebook and Google?
I think the answer has to be no, simply because our demands are, from what we've seen, have never stopped growing. And from what I see around here, I don't see any shrinkage in the amount of demand we're going to have for capacity and bandwidth. I mean, in the number of, we talk, well, we've achieved HD video now. And video is obviously, if we talk about demands on bandwidth, I think the discussion almost should devolve to what's video going to do? Because voice is now irrelevant. The sensor data, sensors sending is kind of irrelevant in terms of capacity. It's all about video. But video goes to up to 4K, then 8K on your phone, and then I want to wear VR goggles that give me a 360-degree sphere and high resolution that don't make me vomit. So it has to be very low latency and high bandwidth. So we see this ongoing demand for increased amounts of data, which I don't particularly see us ever being satiated. And as soon as we say, well, like we thought, well, how much bandwidth do you need from the home? Hey, a 1080p video stream only takes X kilobits per second, sub megabit per second. So, 1.5 megabits is adequate DSL or broadband. Sure, well, what about, that's one, but what if your kids are watching in the next room and your cousin's watching in the other room? So now we have readily happening, probably in lots of people's houses right here, multiple streams of 1080p going to the house, as well as maybe a 4K stream. So our demands are, and that's, I studied economics, and that's the fundamental principle of economics is, demand, needs will always be ever increasing, will always be there, and the scarcity is what you have to address. And spectrum is scarce. So the answer to that is, in this roundabout way, we will not ever have enough. We will always need to manage intelligently what we have.
I'll grant that spectrum is scarce, and certainly it's the message that I drive home to policymakers in Congress at the FCC that we need more of it, that we need the federal government to take more action. But at the same time, maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic. Someone came to me with a question recently about 5G. They said, oh, well, you need to do your virtual reality headset, connecting to the 5G device base station that's sort of on the other side of the room. And someone in the room pipes up, why don't you just plug the thing in? And at some point, when you're talking about small cells and you're talking about short distances at above 95 gigahertz, at some point you'll plug the thing in. And do I believe that there will be enough build out, in the next 5 years to be using your VR headset in the middle of the rural countryside somewhere in Texas? Probably not. But at the same time, a lot of good 5G policy and spectrum policy is a lot of good 4G policy. You still need lower and mid-band spectrum to reach out to parts of the country that are not served at all yet, and 5G is going to come on top of that. So yes, we need more spectrum, particularly in urban areas where you have exploding demand and everyone is getting used to doing, eventually 4K and 8K television on their laptop or mobile device. But, there's a role for a wired ecosystem too. So I think it'll all work together, and I'm actually a little more optimistic about it.
So to the question specifically as asked, is there enough to continue to drive innovation? Yes, there's enough for lots of ongoing innovation. That's the promising thing. It will never be enough for all of our needs, but it will support lots of innovation.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, you'd like them to be a bit hungry and driven to use spectrum efficiently rather than just take advantage of an unlimited amount of spectrum. And I think that drives innovation as well, right, guys?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I hate unlimited. I skew on the consumer side, but I think unlimited data creates market distortion, and we see developers build apps that don't give a crap about how much data they use, that historically, and then we see, because why do they do that? Because the consumers don't care, and then the consumer doesn't even know that their second app is suffering because their first app is using all their bandwidth. So having a respect for scarce resources, consumer, developer, network operator, all the way up to policymaker, is an important way to respect the scarce resource.
Well, for some reason, guys, our clock has stopped at 18, which allows us unlimited time to continue this discussion. I'm guessing there's something wrong, and we should probably call it a day. What do you think?
If it stopped at 58, it would be 2 minutes to midnight. But
There'll be plenty of time for you guys to ask questions in subsequent panels, but I'm going to thank these guys for entertaining us for the last 40 minutes or so. Thanks.
Thank you.
That was fun.
All right. Yes, take a break now. Great. All right. Thanks, guys, again. Thanks, Burj. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Philippe. All right, guys. So we're a little behind schedule, as always, because that's just going to happen. But we're going to try to make some time here on the break. So we have a break right now. It's coffee over there. There's some sugar over there. But we want to get started with our next session at